It's late, maybe you can't sleep. Maybe you're winding down from a long day. Maybe you just want something to fill the quiet hours before the sun comes back up. Either way, you're here, and so am I. Welcome to Facts Till Dawn, the show where we go deep into the worlds you love, the games, the shows, the stories, and stay there until morning. Tonight, we're going somewhere dark, somewhere cold, somewhere that has broken the spirits of millions of players and somehow made them love it even more for doing so. Tonight, we're going to Lordran, Dark Souls. Released in 2011 by a small Japanese studio called From Software, made by a director who had never led a major project before, shipped with almost no marketing, given to the world quietly like a gift left on a doorstep at midnight. Nobody expected what happened next. Dark Souls did not just become a hit, it became a religion. Players obsessed over its difficulty, yes, but what kept them coming back? What kept them reading, theorizing, arguing, and writing thousands of pages of analysis was something else entirely. It was the world, the lore, the feeling that somewhere, beneath every fog gate and item description, there was a truth waiting to be uncovered. That's what we're here for tonight. We're not going to talk about tips and tricks. We're not going to rank the bosses or debate the best build. What we're going to do is slow down. We're going to look at the parts of Dark Souls that most players ran past, the stories hidden in the margins, the decisions made by developers that almost nobody knows about, the lore that doesn't announce itself. It just sits there quietly, waiting for you to notice it. There's a lot to get through. We'll talk about gods and their secrets. We'll talk about a man who changed his entire life because of a video game. We'll talk about a gift that does absolutely nothing and the chaos it caused. We'll talk about a blacksmith who might have known your destiny the entire time. By the time we're done, you might see Dark Souls differently. Or maybe you'll just fall asleep with Lordran in your head. Both of those sound pretty good to me. Light the bonfire. Get comfortable. We've got all night. To understand Dark Souls, you have to go back to the very beginning, not the beginning of the game. The beginning of everything, before the world had a name, before there were kingdoms or gods or fire. There was only gray, an endless, colorless fog stretching in every direction. Ancient dragons moved through it like shadows, enormous, immortal, barely present. They weren't evil. They weren't good. They simply were. The world belonged to them, and it had for longer than anyone could remember. Nothing changed. Nothing grew. Nothing died. Time didn't really exist yet because without change there's nothing to measure time against. The world just was. A flat, gray, eternal nothing, and then, deep underground, something ignited, the first flame. Nobody summoned it. Nobody built it. It simply appeared, a fire at the heart of the world, burning for no reason with no explanation. And from it came something incredible: disparity. The concept of opposites, hot and cold, life and death, light and dark. Before the first flame, the world had no contrast. Afterward, everything did. And near that flame, 4 beings found something extraordinary. 4 fragments of raw, primordial power. The Lord's souls. These weren't weapons or artifacts. They were closer to fundamental forces, pieces of existence itself, shaped into something that could be held and wielded. And the 4 beings who found them would become the most powerful forces the world had ever seen. The first was Gwyn. He claimed the soul of light, a soul blazing with power, described in the game's lore as the greatest of all the Lord's souls. Gwyn used it to build a civilization. He raised an army of silver knights. He created a kingdom that would eventually become the shining city of Anor Londo, visible for miles in every direction, radiating golden light like a second sun. The second was Nito, the first of the dead. He claimed a soul of death itself, and became a being of pure decay, a skeleton wrapped in funeral shrouds, walking embodiment of mortality. Where Gwyn built things up, Nito existed to remind the world that everything ends. The third was the Witch of Izalith. She and her daughters claimed a soul of fire, becoming pyromancers of unimaginable skill. Their story doesn't end well, we'll come back to that, but in the beginning they were a force of warmth and creation. And the fourth being is where things get interesting. His name, if you can even call it that, is the Furtive Pygmy. He appears in the opening cinematic of Dark Souls for exactly 2 seconds. If you haven't specifically gone looking for him, you've almost certainly missed him. The camera sweeps past 4 great figures standing near the first flame, and there he is small, hunched, almost hidden behind the others. And then he's gone. The game never explains him. Most NPCs never mention him. He has no dialogue, no boss fight, no quest line. He is, in every sense of the word, furtive, a word that means secretive, done by stealth, as if afraid of being seen. But what the Furtive Pygmy did may be the single most important act in the entire history of the Dark Souls universe. He found a 5th soul. Hidden near the first flame, separate from the other 4, was something darker, something the others had overlooked or ignored. It was called the Dark Soul. And unlike the other Lord Souls, which were about power, death, light, fire, the Dark Soul was about something harder to define. It was about humanity, about the small, fragile, persistent nature of human life. The Furtive Pygmy took the Dark Soul, and then he did something none of the other lords did. He didn't keep it. He didn't build a kingdom with it or raise an army. Instead, he shattered it. He broke it into thousands, maybe millions, of tiny pieces, and he let those pieces scatter into the world. Those fragments became the first humans. Think about what that means for a moment. Every person in the world of Dark Souls, every undead cursed to keep dying and rising again, every hollow shambling through the ruins, every NPC sitting by a fire in the dark, each one of them carries a tiny fragment of the Dark Soul inside them. Humanity in this world is literally made of shattered godhood, and you, the player, collect these fragments. Throughout the game, you gather something simply called humanity, a small, dark, curling wisp. You use it to reverse hollowing, to kindle bonfires, to summon allies. You treat it like a resource, a currency. But what you are actually holding every single time is a piece of the Furtive Pygmy's soul, a fragment of the god who decided that power was better shared than hoarded. Now here's where the story turns dark, and not the kind of dark you can fix with a torch. Gwyn saw what the Furtive Pygmy had done, and it terrified him, because the Dark Soul, even shattered into millions of pieces, didn't lose its power. It kept generating life. It kept growing, spreading, multiplying through every human who was born and died and passed their fragment on to the next generation. The abyss, that creeping darkness you encounter in areas like New Londo, is what happens when that power concentrates. When enough fragments of the Dark Soul come together in one place, they become something enormous and uncontrollable. Gwyn understood something that his own pride wouldn't let him say out loud. Humanity was going to outlast him. The Age of Fire, his age, the age of gods and sunlight and kingdoms built on divine authority, had a timer on it. One day the first flame would fade, and when it did, the Age of Dark would begin. The age of humans, the age of the Dark Soul, so he did something desperate. He walked into the first flame and burned himself alive, not because he was noble, not because he was sacrificing himself for the good of the world. He did it because he was afraid. By linking his soul to the fire, he kept it burning longer than it should have naturally burned, delaying the Age of Dark, delaying the rise of humanity, clinging to his world for just a little more time. And then he commanded his children and his knights and his followers to maintain the cycle, to find new souls to link to the fire whenever it began to fade again, to keep the lie going, to keep the humans down. This is the cycle you are born into at the start of Dark Souls, a world that has been burning on borrowed time for thousands of years, a god who died not in glory but in fear. An undead curse spreading across humanity because the flame is weakening and there aren't enough souls left to feed it. And you, hollow, forgotten, waking up in a cell with no memory of who you are a descendant of the furtive pygmy. You carry the dark soul, the very thing Gwyn was afraid of. The entire game is built on one idea. The god of light built his kingdom on a lie, and eventually someone carrying the power he feared would come to end it. That someone is you. Every game has a story behind the story. The world you play through, the bosses you fight, the lore you piece together in the dark, all of it came from somewhere. From decisions made in meeting rooms, from arguments between designers, from one person's obsession or fear or memory bleeding into the pixels on your screen. Dark Souls came from one man more than anyone else, and his story is almost as strange as the game itself. His name is Hidetaka Miyazaki, and for most of his life, video games were not part of his plan. Miyazaki grew up in Shizuoka, Japan, in a family that didn't have much money. He was a quiet kid, the kind who spent a lot of time alone with books. He loved fantasy, the old kind, the dark kind, the kind where heroes didn't always win and the world didn't always make sense. He would borrow books from the library and read them cover to cover, or try to anyway. Here's the thing. A lot of the books he loved were in English, and Miyazaki's English at the time wasn't strong enough to understand everything. He would read a paragraph, understand maybe half of it, and then reach a part he couldn't follow. And instead of putting the book down or finding a translation, he did something else. He made up the rest. He filled the gaps with his own imagination. The characters he didn't understand became whatever he needed them to be. The plot points he couldn't follow became mysteries he invented solutions for. He was, without knowing it, writing alongside the authors, adding his own stories to theirs in real time. That habit never left him. When he eventually made games, he built worlds the same way he read those books, with gaps, with half-answers, with item descriptions that hint at something enormous without ever fully explaining it. He wanted players to do what he had done as a child. Take the fragments they were given and build something in the space between them. Every time you read a cryptic item description in Dark Souls and feel that strange pull, that feeling that there's a story here, if only you could piece it together, you are having the experience that Miyazaki had as a boy with a borrowed book he couldn't fully read. But here's what makes his story even more remarkable. Miyazaki didn't go into game development straight away. He studied literature at university, fitting, given everything we just said, and then went into business. He got a job at a software company, a regular corporate job. Meetings, spreadsheets, performance reviews. The kind of life that has nothing to do with dragons or bonfires or ancient gods. And then, in his late 20s, a friend handed him a PlayStation controller and told him to try a game. The game was Ico, released in 2001 by Sony. A quiet, melancholy puzzle game about a boy with horns trying to escape a castle while protecting a ghost girl. No combat system to speak of. No big explosions. Just atmosphere and silence, and the feeling that the world you were moving through had a history you would never fully understand. Miyazaki played it and felt something shift. He quit his job. At an age when most people are settling deeper into their careers, he walked away from the corporate world and applied to From Software, a mid-sized Japanese studio that mostly made mecha games nobody outside Japan had heard of. He had no game development experience. He was, by his own admission, a complete beginner. From Software took a chance on him anyway. He started at the bottom. Junior roles, small contributions, learning the craft from scratch. But he kept moving. By 2009, he was directing Demon Souls, a brutal, strange, atmospheric action RPG that almost didn't get released outside Japan because publishers thought it was too difficult and too weird. It became a cult classic almost overnight, and then came Dark Souls. Now here's something that might surprise you about Dark Souls. One of its most beloved and unique features, the multiplayer system, wasn't born from a design meeting. It wasn't a feature someone pitched in a presentation. It came from a memory. Miyazaki has told this story in interviews, and it's one of those things that sounds almost too perfect to be real. He was driving home one winter evening on a mountain road. It had been snowing heavily, and the road was icy. Cars ahead of him had started to slip, losing traction, sliding, struggling to make it up the hill. And then something happened that stayed with him. The cars that had made it to the top turned around. They came back. And they pushed the cars that were struggling, strangers helping strangers silently, without being asked, without expecting anything in return. Nobody coordinated it. Nobody announced it. It just happened the way good things sometimes do. Miyazaki thought, what if a game could feel like that? What if players could help each other without ever meeting? Without lobbies or party systems or voice chat? What if you could leave a message for a stranger who would read it hours later, in the same dark corridor you had just survived, and that message could save their life? That's where the messages system came from. That's where the bloodstains came from, those ghostly replays of other players dying, warning you what was around the corner. That's where co-op summoning came from. The entire interconnected, ghostly, silent multiplayer of Dark Souls grew out of a snowy road and a group of strangers pushing cars uphill. A game about isolation, built on an act of community. And one more thing before we move on, because this one genuinely surprised me when I first found out about it. You've been to Anor Londo. If you've played Dark Souls, you remember the moment you arrive there. After hours of gray stone and dark dungeons, the world suddenly opens up into something impossible. Towering cathedrals, warm golden light, architecture that feels designed for beings 10 times the size of a human. It's breathtaking. It's the first moment in the game that feels genuinely like you've arrived somewhere sacred. Miyazaki and his team traveled to Europe during development. Italy, France, trips taken specifically to gather the visual language of the game's world. And Anor Londo's cathedral architecture is directly inspired by the Duomo di Milano. The Milan Cathedral, one of the most ornate Gothic buildings on Earth, covered in spires and statues, designed to make you feel small in the best possible way. If you've ever stood outside the Duomo and felt that particular kind of awe, the feeling that something was built by people who believed in something bigger than themselves, then you've already felt a little of what Anor Londo is trying to give you. And the Great Hollow, those enormous ancient trees descending into darkness below Blighttown. Miyazaki has said those were influenced by the giant tree from the film Avatar. The world you've been exploring is built from real places, real memories, real moments of awe that a quiet kid from Shizuoka carried with him across decades and eventually poured into a game. That's what you're walking through every time you play Dark Souls. Someone's entire life turned into a world. Every great game has secrets. Hidden rooms, coded messages, Easter eggs tucked away in corners that most players never reach. But Dark Souls does something different with its secrets. In most games, secrets are rewards. You find the hidden room, you get the bonus item, you feel clever, you move on. In Dark Souls, secrets are invitations. An invitation to question what you think you know. To look again at something you walked past 100 times. To wonder whether the world is exactly what it appeared to be, or whether everything you trusted was a carefully maintained illusion. Let's start with the greatest prank ever pulled on a gaming community. At the very beginning of Dark Souls, before you've fought a single enemy, the game asks you to make a choice. You pick your class, you customize your character, and then you're offered a starting gift. A small bonus to take with you into the world. Most gifts are useful. You can start with a firebomb or a small ring or a key. Practical things for a brutal world. But one gift sits at the bottom of the list, almost apologetically. It's called the pendant, and its item description reads simply, "No effect. It's just a small pendant. No effect." Now, most players read that and move on. But some stopped. Some players thought, this is Dark Souls. Nothing in this game is meaningless. Every item description means something. Why would they include a starting gift that does literally nothing? Why does it exist? And then, in an interview shortly after the game's release, a journalist asked Miyazaki directly, "If you had to choose one starting gift, what would you pick?" He smiled. And he said the pendant. The internet lost its mind, theories spread overnight. Players combed through every inch of the game looking for what the pendant unlocked. Maybe it was connected to a secret ending. Maybe it opened a hidden area. Maybe giving it to a specific NPC triggered something nobody had discovered yet. Thousands of hours of investigation. Hundreds of video essays. An entire community convinced that somewhere, buried in the code, the pendant was the key to something extraordinary. It wasn't years later Miyazaki came clean. He was joking. The pendant genuinely has no effect. It does nothing. He said he recommended it partly as a test. He wanted to see if players would trust that the game meant what it said, or if they would go looking for depth that wasn't there. The community went looking. Of course they did. Miyazaki seemed delighted by this. And honestly, it tells you everything about why Dark Souls worked. The players weren't wrong to look. In a game where item descriptions hide the history of entire civilizations, where NPCs speak in riddles that take years to decode, where the true villain of the story is buried under layers of misdirection, the assumption that nothing is meaningless is completely reasonable. He built a world where that assumption made sense. And then he put one thing in it that was exactly what it said it was. That's the pendant. The most studied, analyzed, and celebrated item that does absolutely nothing. Now let's talk about a secret that's hiding in plain sight. Anor Londo is the turning point of Dark Souls. After hours of grim dungeons and relentless difficulty, the game opens up into something that feels almost like mercy. You step out onto a sunlit rooftop and the city spreads out before you, golden light, impossible spires, the feeling that you've made it somewhere that matters. And at the heart of it, in a great cathedral, you meet Guinevere. She is enormous, warm, radiant. She greets you like you're exactly the hero the world has been waiting for. She gives you the Lord Vessel, the item you need to progress. She blesses you. And everything about the encounter is designed to make you feel, for maybe the first time in the game, that someone is genuinely glad you're here. And then, if you attack her, she disappears. Not dramatically. Not with a boss health bar or a battle cry. She simply dissolves like smoke in the wind. And in the same instant, every source of light in Anor Londo goes out. The warm golden glow that defined the entire city vanishes. The sky darkens. The area that felt like a paradise suddenly reveals itself as something cold and abandoned. New enemies appear in the darkness, silver knights who weren't there before, now stalking the corridors you thought you'd cleared. What the game reveals in that moment is that Guinevere was never there. She was an illusion, a projection created by Gwendolyn, the youngest child of Gwyn, who has been hiding beneath Anor Londo this entire time. Gwendolyn is a complicated figure in the lore, born with an affinity for the moon rather than the sun, raised in secret, using illusion magic to maintain the appearance of a thriving divine city long after the gods had abandoned it. The warmth, the light, the benevolent goddess. All of it was Gwendolyn, alone in the dark, maintaining a performance for anyone who wandered in. No other NPC death in the entire game changes the environment around you. Not one. Guinevere is the only character whose disappearance physically transforms the world. The game itself reacts to the loss of the illusion, and most players never see it. Because most players never attack her, why would you? She's kind. She helps you. She looks like she's on your side. That's exactly the point. Let's talk about what's inside the painted world of Ariamis. To even enter the painted world, you need an item called the Peculiar Doll, found in the Northern Undead Asylum, the prison you escape from at the very start of the game. If you return to the asylum later and find the doll, you can use it to step inside a painting hanging in Anor Londo. A painting of a cold, snow-covered world. The painted world itself is optional. You never have to go there. Most of the game's main path doesn't require it. And yet it's one of the most carefully constructed areas in the entire game, full of enemies, lore, a boss, and a character named Priscilla who stands at the end of it all and asks you, gently, to please just leave. Her dialogue is remarkable for Dark Souls, a game not known for gentle dialogue. She says the painted world is a place of refuge for those who have no place in the outside world. The enemies you fought to reach her, the undead, the strange crow-human hybrids, the toxic creatures in the swamp below, are all beings that were cast out, painted into this world and sealed away because the outside world didn't want them. Priscilla herself is a crossbreed half-dragon, half something else. The item descriptions surrounding her story suggest she was created as an experiment, something between species that didn't fit cleanly into the order Gwen was trying to maintain. So she was painted away, sealed into a canvas, given a world just large enough to disappear into. And she's made peace with it. She doesn't want to fight you. She wants you to turn around and leave her people alone. If you do leave without fighting her, she simply watches you go. There's no reward, no special item for showing mercy. The game acknowledges your choice with silence. If you fight her, because she does drop a useful weapon, she defends herself with a scythe made of life hunt energy, apologizing as she attacks you. She apologizes. In a game full of monsters who want to kill you, Priscilla is one of the very few beings who explains herself, who tells you the truth about where she is and why she's there, and who, even while trying to survive, treats the encounter as a tragedy rather than a battle, a painted exile who just wanted to be left in peace. Dark Souls hides things like that everywhere. You just have to be willing to go looking and willing to sit with what you find when you get there. Let's zoom out for a moment. We've talked about the world inside Dark Souls, the lore, the secrets, the people who made it. But there's one more story worth telling, and it's the story of what happened after. What Dark Souls left behind when it walked out into the world in 2011 and quietly changed everything. Because it did change everything. Just not immediately, and not in the way anyone expected. When Dark Souls first released, the response was divided. Critics were impressed but cautious. Players were fascinated but frustrated. The game was brutally difficult in a gaming landscape that had spent years moving in the opposite direction, toward accessibility, toward checkpoints every few minutes, toward games that held your hand and made sure you always felt like you were winning. Dark Souls did none of that. It dropped you in a world with no map, no quest markers, no explanation of its systems, and enemies that could kill you in 2 hits. And then it waited to see what you would do. A lot of players quit. That's worth saying honestly. Dark Souls is not for everyone, and it was never designed to be. Miyazaki has said in interviews that he never intended the difficulty to be the point. He wanted the feeling of overcoming something real, and the difficulty was simply the price of making that feeling genuine. You can't feel like you've conquered something unless it actually tried to stop you. But something unexpected happened in the weeks after release. Players started talking to each other, not just complaining, though there was plenty of that, but actually pooling knowledge, sharing discoveries, building wikis overnight, uploading videos of boss strategies, leaving messages in the game itself for strangers they would never meet. The community that formed around Dark Souls was unlike anything that had happened around a game before. It wasn't organized. There was no developer guiding it, no official forum driving the conversation. It just grew, organically, because the game had given people something they needed: a shared struggle, and a world mysterious enough to keep them asking questions long after they'd finished playing. That community is still active today. Over a decade later, players are still finding things in Dark Souls that nobody noticed before, still debating the lore, still running the game in new ways: no hits, no leveling up with a Guitar Hero controller, blindfolded. The game keeps generating new experiences because it was built with enough depth that no single playthrough exhausts it. But the legacy of Dark Souls isn't just its community. It's the shape it gave to an entire generation of games. Before Dark Souls, the games that tried to be genuinely difficult were mostly niche. Punishing games existed, but they weren't mainstream. After Dark Souls, something shifted. Developers started asking a question they hadn't asked in a long time. What if we trusted players to figure things out? The word Souls-like appeared. First as internet slang, then in game reviews, then in developer interviews, then eventually in the vocabulary of the entire industry. It describes a specific set of qualities: deliberate combat, environmental storytelling, sparse checkpoints, death as a learning tool, that Dark Souls essentially invented the modern version of. Games like Hollow Knight, Celeste, Hades, Sekiro, Nioh, The Surge, Lies of P, and dozens of others exist in the shape that Dark Souls carved. Some of them are direct imitations. Some of them took one specific idea and built something entirely new around it. But all of them owe a debt to a small From Software game that nobody expected to matter. And then there's From Software's own work in Dark Souls' shadow. Bloodborne came in 2015. Set in a Gothic Victorian city called Iharnam, built on the blood of ancient cosmic beings, it took Dark Souls' template and pushed it somewhere stranger and faster and more horrifying. Where Dark Souls was about fire and cycles and the weight of history, Bloodborne was about the terror of knowledge, the idea that some truths, once seen, cannot be unseen, and the fingerprints of Dark Souls are all over it. The bonfire became a lamp. The Estus flask became blood vials. The fog gates, the cryptic NPCs, the world that rewards patience and punishes carelessness. All of it carries the DNA of what Miyazaki built in 2011. Then Dark Souls 2. Then Dark Souls 3. Then Sekiro, which stripped away the RPG elements entirely and replaced them with a pure test of rhythm and reaction. And then, in 2022, Elden Ring. Elden Ring took everything From Software had learned across a decade of making Souls-like games and poured it into an open world. The result was one of the highest-rated games ever made. It sold over 25 million copies. It was reviewed in mainstream newspapers by journalists who hadn't covered games in years. It made Miyazaki, the man who quit his corporate job because of a PlayStation game, one of the most celebrated creative directors in the history of the medium. And at its core, in its storytelling approach, in its respect for player intelligence, in its willingness to let the world speak for itself through the things left behind rather than the things explained, it is unmistakably the child of Dark Souls. But here's what I want to leave you with, because I think it's the most beautiful part of all of this. From Software's games don't just share a design philosophy. They share details, Small, quiet, deliberate connections that reward players who pay attention. Ornstein, the Dragon Slayer, one of the most iconic bosses in Dark Souls, is never confirmed dead. His armor exists. His spear exists. But after you defeat him in Anor Londo, the game never tells you what happened to him. Theories have circulated for years about where he went. And then in Elden Ring, players found something in a distant corner of the map, equipment and imagery that many believe is a reference to Ornstein. Not a direct appearance, not an explanation, just a ghost, a suggestion, a developer quietly leaving a note for the players who remembered. Laddersmith Gilligan is a merchant in Dark Souls 2. A cheerful, slightly absurd character whose entire identity revolves around selling ladders and being enthusiastic about stairs. Players loved him for the sheer specificity of it. And in Dark Souls 3 in the profaned capital, players found his corpse. He had made it to the next world or something like it, and he hadn't survived. No dialogue, no explanation, just his body and the implication that time had passed and taken him with it. A joke character, given a quiet and dignified ending by developers who knew players would remember him. These connections aren't required to enjoy the games. You can play every From Software title without noticing any of them. But for the players who do notice, for the ones who carry the memory of Lordran into every new world they enter, they land like something between an Easter egg and a love letter. A reminder that the people who made these games remember too. We've covered a lot of ground tonight. We walked through the age before fire, when the world was gray and the dragons owned everything. We watched four beings reach into the first flame and pull out the power that would shape all of history. We met the one who barely anyone noticed, the furtive pygmy, and discovered that he may have been the most important of all of them. We learned about a god who built his kingdom on fear, who burned himself alive not out of nobility, but because he couldn't stand the thought of being replaced by the very beings he'd created the world for. We sat with a man who quit his corporate job because of a video game, who filled the gaps in books he couldn't read with his own imagination, and who eventually turned all of that, the books, the memories, the snowy road, the cathedrals of Milan, into a world that millions of people now carry around inside them. We found a goddess who was never there, a painter who just wanted to be left in peace, a blacksmith who might have known your destiny the whole time and never said a word, a pendant that does absolutely nothing and broke the internet anyway. And we stood back and watched what one game, made by one quiet and unlikely person, did to an entire medium. How it gave language to a feeling that players had been chasing for years without knowing what to call it. How it said, plainly and without apology, "We trust you, figure it out." Here's the thing about Dark Souls that I keep coming back to: it's a game about cycles, about things that should end but don't. The fire fades, someone links it, the fire burns again, it fades again. Over and over, across thousands of years, the same story repeating in slightly different forms. And in a strange way, the game itself has become a cycle. Players finish it. Then they start again. Then they find something they missed. Then they go looking for answers and find more questions and go looking again. New players discover it every year and feel the same things the first players felt in 2011. That particular mixture of frustration and wonder, and the stubborn refusal to quit that the game somehow manufactures out of thin air. The fire keeps being linked. By new players, by longtime fans, by content creators and speedrunners and lore hunters and people who just put it on in the background at 2 in the morning, because the ambience makes them feel something they can't name. By people like you, maybe. Listening to this right now, in the dark, letting Lordran settle into the quiet hours of the night. That's what FactTillDawn is here for, not just Dark Souls, all of it. The games, the shows, the anime, the worlds that people build and other people fall in love with and carry around for the rest of their lives. There are stories inside those worlds that deserve to be told slowly, that deserve to be held up to the light and turned over carefully, the way you'd turn over something you found on a beach and weren't sure what it was. We're going to do that here. Every episode, one world at a time. Next time we go somewhere new, a different story, a different fire. But for now, the bonfire is here. The night is quiet, and if sleep is coming for you, let it come. You've earned the rest. This has been Facts Till Dawn. If tonight meant something to you, subscribe and I'll see you at the next one. The fire fades, but it always comes back.